Welcome, dear listener, to this gentle journey through time. Tonight, we travel back to the medieval world of Charlemagne, the great emperor who shaped Europe itself. If you find peace in these quiet historical tales, please consider liking and subscribing. It truly helps me create more of these soothing stories for you to enjoy. Now, settle in comfortably as we begin our journey to the 8th century, where mist rolls over ancient forests and the sound of church bells echoes across quiet valleys. In the soft twilight of an April evening in the year 742, when the world was young and Europe was a patchwork of kingdoms wrapped in morning mist, a child was born who would become the father of a continent. The spring air carried the scent of apple blossoms through the windows of a modest palace in the Frankish lands, where Queen Bertrada held her newborn son close to her heart. They called him Charles, though history would remember him by a grander name, Charlemagne, Charles the Great. The Frankish kingdom stretched across lands that would one day be called France and Germany, a realm of rolling hills and deep forests where oak trees stood like ancient sentinels and streams meandered through meadows carpeted with wildflowers. It was a world where the Roman Empire's memory still lingered like morning dew, where Latin prayers rose from monastery walls, and where the old Germanic traditions flowed alongside Christian faith, like two rivers meeting in a peaceful valley. Charles's father, Pepin the Short, was a man of quiet strength and steady wisdom. Though not tall in stature, as his name suggested, Pepin possessed the kind of presence that commanded respect without demanding it. He ruled the Franks with a gentle hand, understanding that true power lay not in the sword alone, but in the trust of his people and the blessing of God. His court was a place where learned men gathered to discuss philosophy and theology, where the copying of manuscripts proceeded in peaceful scriptoriums, and where the business of governing was conducted with patience and careful thought. The young Charles grew up in this atmosphere of measured authority and intellectual curiosity. As a child, he would wander through the halls of his father's palace, his footsteps echoing softly on stone floors, worn smooth by generations of rulers. The walls were adorned with tapestries that told stories of Frankish victories and Christian virtue, their colors muted by time and candlelight into something dreamlike and eternal. From his earliest years, Charles displayed an extraordinary mind, housed in an equally extraordinary body. He grew tall and strong, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of kingdoms and hands large enough to grasp both sword and scripture with equal ease. His hair was light brown, catching the sun like wheat fields in summer, and his eyes held the clear blue of northern skies after rain. But it was not merely his physical presence that set him apart. It was the way he listened, the way he absorbed knowledge like dry earth drinks in gentle rain. The education of a Frankish prince in the 8th century was a careful balance of practical skills and scholarly pursuits. Charles learned to ride before he could properly walk, his small hands gripping the reins of a gentle palfrey as he circled the courtyard under the watchful eye of master horsemen. He learned to handle weapons with the same methodical care, understanding that a sword was not merely a tool of war, but a symbol of justice and protection for those who could not protect themselves. Yet alongside these martial arts, Charles delved deep into the world of learning that would shape his entire reign. He studied Latin with patient tutors who corrected his pronunciation with gentle persistence, understanding that language was the key to both divine worship and earthly administration. He memorized passages from Scripture, not as a burden, but as a treasure to be carried within the heart. The Psalms became his companions, their verses flowing through his mind like water over smooth stones, bringing comfort in times of difficulty and inspiration in moments of triumph. The palace school where Charles received his education was a place of quiet industry, where young nobles and future clergy sat side by side at wooden tables, copying texts by the light of tall windows that filtered the sun into golden bars across the floor. The scratching of quills on parchment created a peaceful rhythm, punctuated by the soft voices of instructors and the occasional rustle of turning pages. Here, the wisdom of the ages was passed down with the same care that farmers use to tend their crops, understanding that knowledge, like grain, needed time and patience to grow into something that could nourish a world. As Charles entered his teenage years, his father began to include him in the daily business of governing. The young prince would sit quietly in the corner of the great hall during assemblies, watching as Pepin listened to petitions from farmers and merchants, nobles and clerics. He observed how his father weighed each decision carefully, considering not just the immediate consequences, but the long-term effects on the kingdom's peace and prosperity. These early lessons in leadership were like seeds planted in fertile soil. Charles learned that a king's first duty was to his people, that justice must be tempered with mercy, and that the strongest foundation for any realm was the willing loyalty of those who lived within its borders. He watched his father negotiate with neighboring kingdoms, seeing how diplomacy could accomplish what warfare could not, how a well-crafted treaty could bring decades of peace, while a hasty battle might yield only temporary gain. The Frankish kingdom of Charles's youth was a land of gentle beauty and ancient mystery. Vast forests stretched beyond the horizon, their canopies so thick that noon felt like twilight beneath the trees. These woods were home to deer and wild boar, to hermit monks who sought solitude among the oak groves, and to the occasional wolf whose howl would echo across the valleys on clear winter nights. Rivers wound through the landscape like silver ribbons, their banks lined with willows that drooped their branches into the slow-moving water. In the clearings between the forests, farming communities thrived in peaceful isolation. Stone cottages with thatched roofs sent thin columns of smoke into the morning air, while fields of barley and rye rippled in the wind like earthbound oceans. Church bells marked the hours with their bronze voices, calling the faithful to prayer and reminding all who heard them that their lives were part of something larger and more eternal than the daily round of plowing and harvesting. The monasteries that dotted the countryside were beacons of learning and devotion in this rural landscape. Behind their walls, monks copied manuscripts with painstaking care, their scriptoriums filled with the soft sound of turning pages and the gentle scrape of pen on parchment. These holy men preserved not only the sacred texts of Christianity, but also the classical works of Rome and Greece, understanding that wisdom was a treasure to be guarded and shared across the generations. As Charles approached manhood, his father's health began to decline, with the quiet inevitability of autumn leaves falling from the trees. Pepin had ruled well and wisely, but the years of constant vigilance, of balancing the needs of his kingdom against the pressures of neighboring powers, had taken their toll. He grew thinner and more contemplative, spending long hours in prayer and in consultation with his most trusted advisors about the future of the Frankish realm. The question of succession was never far from anyone's mind during these twilight years of Pepin's reign. The Frankish tradition called for the kingdom to be divided between a ruler's sons, a practice that ensured each would have a realm to govern, but often led to rivalry and conflict. Charles had a younger brother, Charlemagne, who was equally capable and equally ambitious. The relationship between the brothers was cordial but complex, marked by the kind of careful courtesy that often masks deeper tensions. Charlemagne was different from Charles in temperament and interests. Where Charles was expansive and diplomatic, comfortable in the company of both warriors and scholars, Charlemagne was more introspective and deeply religious. He showed a particular aptitude for administrative detail and a genuine compassion for the struggles of ordinary people. The brothers complemented each other in many ways, but their different approaches to governance would soon become a source of subtle but persistent friction. When Pepin died in the year 768, the kingdom was indeed divided as tradition demanded. Charles received the western and northern portions, including the heartland of the Frankish realm, while Charlemagne inherited the eastern and southern territories. The division was accomplished with the same careful attention to justice that had characterized Pepin's entire reign, with borders drawn to ensure that each brother received lands of roughly equal value and strategic importance. The early years of this joint rule were marked by an atmosphere of cautious cooperation. The brothers maintained separate courts, but consulted with each other on matters of mutual concern. They coordinated their responses to external threats and worked together to maintain the internal peace that their father had bequeathed to them. Yet beneath the surface of this collaboration, the fundamental question remained: could two kings truly govern one people, or would the logic of power eventually drive them apart? Charles established his court at Aachen, a place that would become synonymous with his name and his vision for Europe. The town lay in a valley where hot springs bubbled up from the earth, their mineral-rich waters creating an oasis of warmth even in the depths of winter. Here, Charles began to build not just a palace, but a new kind of center for medieval civilization, a place where the practical business of governing would be conducted alongside the higher pursuits of learning and culture. The palace at Aachen was designed to reflect Charles's understanding of kingship as both a worldly and a spiritual calling. The great hall where he held court was built on a scale that impressed visitors while remaining comfortable for daily use. Its walls were decorated with mosaics that told the story of Christian history, from the creation of the world to the triumph of the faith over pagan darkness. Light streamed through tall windows during the day, and in the evening, hundreds of candles created a warm, golden atmosphere that seemed to embody the peace and prosperity of the realm. Adjacent to the palace, Charles ordered the construction of a chapel that would serve as both a place of worship and a symbol of his commitment to Christian kingship. The chapel's design drew inspiration from the great churches of Byzantium, with its soaring dome and intricate decorations speaking to the universal nature of the Christian faith. Here, Charles would attend daily Mass, his deep voice joining in the ancient chants that had been sung in Christian churches for centuries. The court at Aachen became a magnet for scholars, artists, and clergy from across Europe and beyond. Men of learning came seeking patronage and found instead a community of like-minded souls dedicated to the preservation and advancement of human knowledge. The Palace School, which had been established initially for the education of Charles's own children and the sons of nobles, gradually expanded into something approaching a medieval university. In the scriptoriums of Aachen, monks and scholars worked to copy and preserve the texts of classical antiquity alongside the sacred scriptures of Christianity. They developed new forms of handwriting that were clearer and more elegant than anything that had come before, understanding that the physical beauty of a text was part of its spiritual and intellectual value. The soft scratch of quills on parchment became the constant background music of the palace, a gentle reminder that the work of civilization was always in progress. Charles himself was an eager participant in this scholarly community. Despite the demands of governing an increasingly large kingdom, he made time each day for reading and study. He learned to read Greek, though he never mastered it completely, and maintained his fluency in Latin throughout his life. He particularly enjoyed discussions of theology and philosophy, often staying up late into the night debating points of doctrine with visiting scholars or discussing the finer points of classical literature. The king's commitment to learning was not merely personal, but reflected his understanding that education was essential to effective governance. He believed that a ruler needed to understand not just the practical arts of war and diplomacy, but also the deeper currents of human thought and divine purpose that shaped history. This intellectual curiosity would prove to be one of his greatest strengths as his realm expanded and the challenges of ruling became increasingly complex. The relationship between Charles and his brother Charlemagne remained cordial, but grew more strained as the years passed. The brothers had different visions for the future of the Frankish kingdom, different approaches to dealing with external threats, and different ideas about the role of the church in secular government. These differences might have remained manageable if both brothers had lived long lives, but fate had other plans. In the year 771, when Charles was still in his 20s, Charlemagne died suddenly after a brief illness. The death of his brother was both a personal loss and a political opportunity that would reshape the future of Europe. According to Frankish law, Charlemagne's territories should have passed to his young sons, but Charles moved quickly to claim the entire kingdom for himself. The reunification of the Frankish realm was accomplished with surprising little resistance, as nobles and clergy recognized that a single strong ruler was preferable to a regency governing in the name of children. With the kingdom united under his sole rule, Charles was free to pursue the ambitious plans that had been taking shape in his mind during the years of shared governance. He envisioned a Christian empire that would stretch across Europe, bringing together the various Germanic tribes under a single rule that would be both just and powerful. This vision was not born of mere personal ambition, but reflected a genuine belief that political unity was necessary for both worldly prosperity and spiritual salvation. The first major test of Charles's expanded authority came from the south, where the Lombard kingdom in northern Italy had long been a source of friction with the papal territories. The Lombards, despite their conversion to Christianity, maintained an uneasy relationship with Rome, and their periodic incursions into papal lands created a diplomatic crisis that demanded attention. Pope Hadrian I, a man of gentle wisdom and firm resolve, appealed to Charles for assistance in defending the patrimony of Saint Peter. The Pope's letter, carried north by trusted messengers, painted a picture of Christian lands under threat from fellow Christians who had forgotten their proper relationship to the Church. For Charles, the appeal represented not just a diplomatic opportunity, but a chance to demonstrate his commitment to the faith that was the foundation of his kingdom. The campaign against the Lombards was Charles's first major military undertaking as sole ruler of the Franks, and he approached it with the same methodical care that characterized all his endeavors. The logistical challenges of moving an army across the Alps were immense, requiring months of preparation and the coordination of supplies and equipment on a scale that had not been attempted in generations. The march through the Alpine passes was a testament to both the determination of the Frankish army and the careful planning of their king. The narrow mountain paths, carved by centuries of use into the living rock, could accommodate only a few men at a time. The army moved like a great serpent through the mountains, its head disappearing around distant curves, while its tail was still climbing slopes far behind. The scenery through which they passed was breathtaking in its austere beauty. Snow-capped peaks rose on all sides like the pillars of some vast cathedral, their surfaces catching the light of the sun and reflecting it back in countless shades of white and silver. The air was thin and clear, carrying the sound of their passage for miles across the valleys. At night, the army camped in meadows where wildflowers bloomed in impossible profusion, their bright colors a startling contrast to the stark grandeur of the surrounding peaks. Charles rode at the head of his army, his presence a source of confidence and inspiration to the men who followed him. He shared their hardships, sleeping in the same rough camps and eating the same simple food. When the path became too difficult for horses, he walked alongside his soldiers, his long stride easily keeping pace with their determined march. The descent into Italy revealed a landscape entirely different from the forests and fields of Francia. Here, the sun shone more warmly. The air was perfumed with the scent of olive groves and vineyards, and ancient Roman ruins dotted the countryside like memories of a grander age. The soldiers gazed in wonder at the remains of aqueducts and amphitheaters, tangible reminders that they were walking in the footsteps of Caesar and Augustus. The Lombard capital of Pavia was a city of considerable beauty and strategic importance, situated on the banks of the Ticino River, where the fertile plains of Lombardy stretched away toward the horizon. Its walls were strong and well maintained, its towers rising above the surrounding countryside like stone sentinels. The city had been the seat of Lombard power for over 2 centuries, and its king, Desiderius, was not inclined to surrender without a fight. The siege of Pavia lasted through the better part of a year, a patient affair that tested the endurance of both armies. Charles established his camp outside the city walls, creating what was essentially a temporary town, complete with workshops, kitchens, and even a chapel where daily mass was celebrated. The king used the long months of the siege to good advantage, studying the administrative systems of the conquered territories and beginning to formulate the policies that would govern the integrated kingdom. During the quiet hours of the siege, when the business of war gave way to the longer rhythms of daily life, Charles continued his scholarly pursuits. He brought books with him on campaign, understanding that the mind needed nourishment just as much as the body. In his tent, lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the canvas walls, he would read late into the night, sometimes alone, and sometimes in the company of the learned men who accompanied the army as chaplains and advisors. The eventual surrender of Pavia in 774 marked the end of the Lombard kingdom and the beginning of Charles's reign as King of the Lombards, as well as King of the Franks. The integration of the Lombard territories into the Frankish realm was accomplished with the same careful attention to justice and local customs that would characterize all of Charles's administrative innovations. Rather than simply imposing Frankish law and customs on his new subjects, Charles studied the existing legal traditions and incorporated the best elements into a system that respected local differences while maintaining overall unity. The Lombard nobles who submitted to his rule found themselves not as conquered enemies, but as partners in a larger enterprise, their expertise and local knowledge valued and utilized in the governance of the expanded kingdom. The success of the Italian campaign established Charles's reputation as both a military commander and a wise ruler. News of his victories spread throughout Europe, carried by merchants and pilgrims who had witnessed the transformation of the political landscape. More importantly, the campaign demonstrated that the Frankish kingdom was no longer simply one power among many, but was emerging as the dominant force in Western Europe. From Italy, Charles turned his attention to the north and east, where the Saxon tribes presented a very different kind of challenge. The Saxons were a confederation of Germanic peoples who had resisted Roman conquest and maintained their independence through centuries of pressure from various neighbors. They were fierce warriors with a strong tribal culture, but they were also pagans whose religious practices and social organization were fundamentally different from those of the Christianized Franks. The Saxon Wars would prove to be the longest and most difficult of Charles's reign, lasting over 30 years and requiring a completely different approach from the relatively straightforward conquest of the Lombards. Where the Italian campaign had been a matter of defeating an organized kingdom with recognizable political structures, the Saxon conflict was more like trying to grasp water. Every victory seemed to slip away as soon as it was achieved. The Saxon homeland was a region of dense forests and wide rivers, of marshes and heaths that stretched beyond the horizon. It was a landscape that favored the defenders, offering countless hiding places and escape routes for warriors who knew every path and stream. The forests themselves seemed to take sides in the conflict, their ancient trees standing like guardians over a people who had worshipped in their shadows for generations beyond counting. Charles's approach to the Saxon problem was characteristically methodical and patient. He understood that military conquest alone would not be sufficient to bring these proud peoples into his realm. What was needed was a comprehensive strategy that combined military pressure with diplomatic negotiation, economic incentives with religious conversion, and administrative innovation with respect for local customs. The first Saxon campaigns were launched from fortified bases that Charles established along the frontier. These were not merely military outposts, but centers of Christian civilization, complete with churches, schools, and workshops. They served as beacons of the new order that Charles hoped to establish, places where Saxon nobles could see the benefits of joining the Frankish realm, and where common people could experience the peace and prosperity that came with Christian rule. The seasonal rhythm of the Saxon wars reflected the agricultural calendar that governed all medieval life. Campaigns typically began in late spring, after the planting was done, and young men could be spared from farm work. The armies would march through the summer months, engaging in battles and sieges until the approach of autumn reminded everyone that the harvest needed to be gathered. Then the warriors would return to their homes. The formal hostilities would pause, and the patient work of diplomacy and administration would continue through the winter months. Charles spent many summers in the Saxon lands, learning to appreciate the stark beauty of their landscape and the fierce pride of their people. He came to understand that the Saxons' resistance was not simply political, but cultural and religious, rooted in traditions that stretched back to the dawn of Germanic history. Their gods were the gods of storm and forest, of battle and hearth, and their social structure was based on personal loyalty and warrior honor, rather than the complex hierarchical systems of the Frankish kingdom. The king's approach to Saxon conversion was a delicate balance of persuasion and pressure. He built churches in conquered territories and brought in missionaries to preach the Christian message. But he also understood that genuine conversion could not be forced. The most effective evangelists were often Saxon nobles who had embraced Christianity and could speak to their kinsmen in their own language about the benefits of the new faith. One of the most persistent opponents of Frankish expansion was a Saxon leader named Widukind, whose name means child of the wood, and who seemed to embody all the fierce independence of his people. Widukind was not a king in the conventional sense, but rather a war leader who commanded respect through his courage and cunning rather than through inherited authority. He had the ability to appear anywhere at any time, striking at Frankish outposts and then disappearing back into the forests like a ghost. The conflict with Widukind became deeply personal for Charles, not because of any hatred or animosity, but because each man represented everything that the other was fighting against. Widukind embodied the old Germania, free and wild and pagan, while Charles represented the new order of Christian Europe, organized and civilized and united under divine authority. Their struggle was not just political, but philosophical, a clash between two different visions of what human society should be. The turning point in the Saxon Wars came not through military victory, but through patient diplomacy and the gradual realization on both sides that accommodation was preferable to endless conflict. Widukind eventually came to Charles's court at Aachen, not as a defeated enemy, but as a respected adversary who was ready to negotiate a lasting peace. The Saxon leader's conversion to Christianity was sincere, witnessed by his subsequent loyalty to the Frankish crown and his efforts to help integrate his people into the expanding empire. The baptism of Widukind was conducted with great ceremony in the chapel at Aachen, with Charles himself serving as godfather to his former enemy. The ritual was deeply symbolic, representing not just the conversion of an individual, but the transformation of an entire people. The holy water that flowed over Widukind's head seemed to wash away centuries of conflict and open the possibility of a future where Saxon and Frank could live together as fellow Christians and subjects of the same crown. The integration of the Saxon territories into the Frankish realm was accomplished through the same careful attention to local customs and traditional rites that had characterized the absorption of the Lombard kingdom. Saxon law was preserved and incorporated into the broader legal framework of the empire. Saxon nobles were given positions of responsibility and trust, and Saxon warriors were welcomed into the royal army, where their courage and skill made them valuable allies. While the Saxon wars were reaching their resolution, Charles was also extending his influence in other directions. The Duchy of Bavaria, under the rule of Duke Tassilo, had maintained a precarious independence that was increasingly incompatible with the unified vision of Christian Europe that Charles was creating. The annexation of Bavaria was accomplished through a combination of military pressure and diplomatic maneuvering that demonstrated the king's growing sophistication in statecraft. The Bavarian campaign was notable for its restraint and careful attention to legal forms. Rather than simply conquering the duchy through force of arms, Charles built a legal case for his intervention based on Tassilo's alleged violations of his feudal obligations. The Duke was summoned to appear before a tribunal of Frankish nobles and clergy, where he was formally deposed and his lands were incorporated into the royal domain. This legalistic approach to expansion reflected Charles's understanding that sustainable power required not just military might, but also moral authority. By conducting his annexations according to established legal procedures, he demonstrated that his empire was based on justice rather than mere force. This approach helped to legitimize his rule in the eyes of both his subjects and his neighboring rulers, who could see that the Frankish king operated according to recognizable principles rather than arbitrary will. The expansion of the Frankish realm inevitably brought Charles into contact with powers beyond the Christian world. To the south, across the Pyrenees, lay the Islamic territories of Al-Andalus, where Muslim rulers governed with sophistication and tolerance that was the envy of much of Europe. The relationship between Christian and Muslim Spain was complex, marked by both conflict and cooperation, trade and warfare, mutual respect, and religious antagonism. Charles's involvement in Spanish affairs began with an appeal from some Muslim nobles who were in conflict with the Umayyad emir of Cordoba. These men, following the ancient principle that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, invited the Frankish king to intervene in their internal disputes. The prospect of extending Christian influence into Spain was appealing, but Charles approached the matter with his characteristic caution, understanding that campaigns beyond the Pyrenees would present unique challenges. The march into Spain took the Frankish army through some of the most beautiful and challenging terrain in Europe. The Pyrenees were even more formidable than the Alps, their peaks rising like a wall between the two lands. The passes through these mountains were narrow and treacherous, defended by local peoples who owed allegiance to no distant king and who viewed all armies, Christian or Muslim, as potential threats to their independence. The Spanish campaign of 778 would prove to be one of the few clear failures of Charles's military career, but it was also one of the most instructive. The promised Muslim allies proved unreliable, the local population was hostile, and the logistical challenges of maintaining an army so far from home proved insurmountable. After a brief and unsuccessful siege of Zaragoza, Charles decided to withdraw his forces back across the Pyrenees. It was during this retreat that one of the most famous incidents of Charles's entire career occurred. The rear guard of the Frankish army, commanded by Roland, the king's nephew, was attacked while passing through the narrow defile of Roncevaux. The attack came not from Muslim forces, as later legend would claim, but from local Basque warriors who were defending their homeland against what they saw as foreign invasion. The Battle of Roncevaux was a minor tactical defeat that would grow in the telling until it became one of the great epic tales of medieval literature. Roland and his men fought with desperate courage, but they were overwhelmed by the terrain and the numbers of their enemies. The young commander died with his sword in his hand, his body found among those of his loyal followers when Charles returned with the main army to recover the dead. The loss of Roland was a personal tragedy for Charles, who had loved his nephew like a son. But the king's response to this setback demonstrated the wisdom and maturity that would characterize his entire reign. Rather than seeking immediate revenge or launching another costly campaign, he absorbed the lessons of the defeat and turned his attention to other matters. The Spanish frontier would remain a concern throughout his reign, but never again would he commit resources to projects that could not be sustained. The failure of the Spanish campaign had one unexpected benefit. It forced Charles to think more systematically about the challenges of governing his existing territories rather than simply acquiring new ones. The Frankish realm had grown to enormous size through his conquests, stretching from the Atlantic coast to the Danube, from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. Governing such a vast and diverse territory required administrative innovations that went far beyond the traditional structures of Germanic kingship. Charles's solution to the challenge of imperial administration was characteristically creative and practical. He divided his realm into counties, each governed by a count who served as the king's representative in local affairs. These counts were drawn from the ranks of trusted nobles who had proven their loyalty and competence through years of service. They were given broad authority to maintain order, collect taxes, and administer justice, but they remained answerable to the king and could be removed if they failed in their duties. To ensure that the counts remained loyal and effective, Charles instituted a system of royal inspectors known as missi dominici, or envoys of the Lord. These men traveled throughout the empire in pairs, typically consisting of one layman and one cleric, investigating local conditions and reporting back to the king. They served as the eyes and ears of the central government, ensuring that royal commands were being obeyed and that the people were being treated justly. The missi dominici were chosen for their integrity, intelligence, and loyalty to the crown. They were given extensive powers to investigate complaints, correct abuses, and even remove corrupt officials from office. Their regular circuits throughout the empire created a constant flow of information back to Aachen, allowing Charles to maintain effective control over his far-flung territories despite the primitive communications of the age. This administrative system was supplemented by a comprehensive legal reform that sought to create uniform standards of justice throughout the empire. Charles promulgated a series of capitularies, royal decrees that had the force of law, that addressed everything from criminal procedures to commercial regulations. These laws were designed to supplement rather than replace local customs, creating a framework of imperial law that could accommodate the diverse traditions of the various peoples under Frankish rule. The development of this legal system reflected Charles's deep commitment to justice as the foundation of legitimate government. He believed that a ruler's primary responsibility was to ensure that his subjects were treated fairly, that the weak were protected from the strong, and that disputes were resolved according to established principles rather than personal favoritism. This commitment to justice was not merely pragmatic, but reflected his understanding of kingship as a sacred trust that made him answerable to God for the welfare of his people. Charles's reign was marked by a sustained effort to improve the economic conditions of his subjects. He standardized weights and measures throughout the empire, making trade more efficient and reducing the opportunities for fraud. He reformed the monetary system, introducing new silver coins that were widely accepted and stable in value. He encouraged the development of markets and fairs, understanding that commercial prosperity was essential to the health of the realm. The king's economic policies were guided by Christian principles that emphasized the moral dimensions of commercial activity. He prohibited usury and other practices that he considered exploitative, while encouraging honest trade and productive labor. His capitularies included detailed regulations governing the conduct of merchants, the quality of goods, and the rights of consumers, creating a legal framework that protected both buyers and sellers. Agriculture remained the foundation of the medieval economy, and Charles paid careful attention to the needs of the peasants who worked the land. He issued regulations protecting farmers from excessive taxation and arbitrary seizure of their crops, understanding that agricultural productivity was essential to the prosperity of the entire realm. He encouraged the development of new farming techniques and the clearing of forest land for cultivation, gradually expanding the area under cultivation throughout the empire. The monasteries played a crucial role in Charles's economic strategy, serving as centers of agricultural innovation and technological development. The monks who lived in these communities were often the most educated and technically skilled people in their regions, and they pioneered new methods of farming, craftsmanship, and manufacturing. The king encouraged the foundation of new monasteries and provided them with generous endowments, understanding that these institutions contributed to both the spiritual and material welfare of his subjects. Throughout all these administrative and economic reforms, Charles never lost sight of his primary identity as a Christian king whose authority came from God and whose ultimate purpose was to promote the salvation of his people. His relationship with the church was complex and sometimes tense, but it was always based on a shared commitment to the advancement of Christian civilization. The Pope remained the spiritual head of the Christian world, but Charles's temporal power made him an equal partner in the great work of Christianizing Europe. The king and the papal court maintained an extensive correspondence on matters of theology, church discipline, and pastoral care. Charles regularly sought papal approval for his major initiatives, while the Pope relied on Frankish military power to protect the papal territories from their enemies. This partnership between temporal and spiritual authority reached its culmination in one of the most significant events of the entire medieval period: Charles's coronation as emperor in Rome on Christmas Day in the year 800. The ceremony took place in the ancient Basilica of St. Peter, where the tombs of the apostles reminded all present that they were participating in events that connected them directly to the origins of the Christian faith. The coronation was the result of months of careful planning and negotiation between Charles and Pope Leo III, a man of learning and piety who had sought Frankish protection during a period of political turmoil in Rome. The Pope's decision to crown Charles as emperor was motivated by both practical and theological considerations. Practically, it formalized the relationship between the papacy and the Frankish kingdom. Theologically, it proclaimed that the Christian West now had its own emperor to stand alongside the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople. The ceremony itself was conducted with all the solemnity and grandeur that such an occasion demanded. The basilica was filled with nobles and clergy from throughout the empire, their rich garments and gleaming jewelry creating a tapestry of color in the flickering light of hundreds of candles. The air was heavy with the scent of incense and the sound of ancient chants that had been sung in Christian churches for centuries. Charles approached the altar dressed in the simple robes of a penitent, demonstrating that his elevation to imperial dignity was not a matter of personal ambition, but of divine calling. As he knelt before the altar, Pope Leo placed the golden crown upon his head and pronounced the words that would echo through history: "Long life and victory to Charles Augustus, crowned by God the great and peaceful Emperor of the Romans." The significance of this moment extended far beyond the immediate political implications. The coronation of Charlemagne marked the birth of what would later be called the Holy Roman Empire, a political entity that would endure for over 1,000 years. More importantly, it established the principle that temporal authority in the Christian West came from God through the Church, creating a theoretical framework that would shape European political thought for centuries to come. Charles's reaction to his coronation was characteristically complex and thoughtful. While he accepted the imperial dignity and understood its importance for the future of his realm, he was also aware of the potential complications it created. The Byzantine emperor in Constantinople had never recognized the Pope's right to create a rival emperor in the West, and Charles knew that his new title would create diplomatic difficulties that would require careful management. The emperor, for Charles must now be called by his new title, approached his imperial responsibilities with the same methodical care that had characterized his entire career. He understood that the imperial crown was not merely a symbol, but a commission to create a truly Christian civilization that would serve as a model for the entire world. This vision of a Christian empire based on justice, learning, and piety would guide his actions for the remaining years of his reign. One of Charles's most significant contributions to European civilization was his promotion of learning and education, a movement that historians have called the Carolingian Renaissance. The emperor understood that effective governance required educated administrators, that the church needed learned clergy, and that civilization itself depended on the preservation and transmission of human knowledge. The palace school at Aachen became the intellectual center of this educational revival, attracting scholars from throughout Europe and beyond. These men brought with them manuscripts, ideas, and teaching methods that had been preserved in monasteries and cathedral schools across the continent. Under imperial patronage, they created a curriculum that combined classical learning with Christian theology, producing a generation of educated men who would staff the administration of the empire and serve as teachers in their own communities. Charles himself was an eager participant in this scholarly community, despite the demands of governing an empire that stretched across most of Western Europe. He made time each day for reading and discussion, often gathering with scholars in the evening hours when the business of government was done. These sessions took place in a comfortable chamber adjacent to the Great Hall, where shelves lined with precious manuscripts created an atmosphere of quiet scholarship. The emperor's favorite scholar was an Englishman named Alcuin, a gentle and learned man who had come from the cathedral school at York, bringing with him a love of classical literature and a deep understanding of Christian theology. Alcuin served as the director of the palace school and as Charles's personal tutor in matters of grammar, rhetoric, and biblical interpretation. The relationship between the emperor and his teacher was marked by mutual respect and genuine affection, demonstrating that true learning requires humility regardless of one's worldly status. Under Alcuin's guidance, the palace school developed new methods of teaching that would influence education throughout Europe for centuries to come. The scholars created textbooks that presented complex subjects in clear, accessible language, understanding that knowledge was only valuable if it could be effectively transmitted to others. They standardized the curriculum used in cathedral schools throughout the empire, ensuring that young men preparing for careers in the church or in government would receive a consistent and thorough education. The most visible achievement of the Carolingian Renaissance was the development of a new form of handwriting known as Caroline minuscule. This script was clearer and more legible than the various national hands that had been used previously, making it easier to copy manuscripts accurately and to read texts that had been written in distant places. The adoption of this standardized script throughout the empire facilitated communication and learning, creating a common written language that transcended local boundaries. The scriptoriums of the empire became centers of intense activity as monks and scholars worked to copy the texts that formed the foundation of Christian and classical learning. The soft scratch of quills on parchment created a constant, gentle sound in these chambers, punctuated by the whispered consultations between copyists and the occasional rustle of pages being turned. Each manuscript was a work of art as well as a repository of knowledge, decorated with illuminated letters and marginal illustrations that made the text both beautiful and memorable. Charles took a personal interest in this work of preservation and transmission, understanding that the manuscripts being created in his scriptoriums would carry the wisdom of the ages to future generations. He ordered copies to be made of all the important texts in the Imperial library, ensuring that knowledge would not be lost if individual manuscripts were damaged or destroyed. These books were distributed to cathedral schools and monasteries throughout the empire, creating a network of learning that connected scholars from Ireland to Italy. The emperor's commitment to education extended beyond the palace school to encompass the entire empire. His capitularies included provisions requiring bishops to establish schools in their cathedral cities and abbots to provide education in their monasteries. He mandated that all clergy should be able to read and write Latin competently, understanding that ignorant priests could not effectively serve their congregations or contribute to the intellectual life of the Church. This educational initiative was not limited to the clergy, but extended to the lay nobility as well. Charles required that the sons of counts and other high-ranking officials receive a proper education, either at the palace school or at other approved institutions. He understood that effective administration required educated administrators, and that the long-term stability of the empire depended on having a class of capable and learned men to serve in positions of responsibility. The curriculum developed in the Carolingian schools was based on the 7 liberal arts, divided into the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. This educational program provided students with the intellectual tools they needed to understand both the natural world and the divine order that governed it. Grammar taught them to use language precisely and elegantly. Rhetoric enabled them to speak and write persuasively. Logic helped them to think clearly and avoid error. The quadrivium introduced students to the mathematical and scientific knowledge that was essential for understanding God's creation. Arithmetic was not merely practical calculation, but a means of comprehending the numerical relationships that governed the universe. Geometry revealed the spatial patterns that reflected divine order, while astronomy opened students' minds to the vast scale and elegant movement of the heavens. Music was understood as a form of mathematics that could express the harmony that underlay all existence. Beyond these formal subjects, the Carolingian educational system emphasized moral and spiritual development. Students were required to attend daily Mass and to participate in the liturgical life of their communities. They studied Scripture intensively, not merely as a source of doctrinal knowledge, but as a guide to Christian living. The goal was to produce not just learned men, but good men, individuals who would use their education in service to God and their fellow human beings. The influence of the Carolingian Renaissance extended far beyond the immediate borders of Charles's empire. Scholars who had been trained in the palace school carried their knowledge and methods to other parts of Europe, establishing schools and scriptoriums that perpetuated the educational ideals developed at Aachen. The manuscripts copied in Carolingian scriptoriums were distributed throughout the Christian world, ensuring that the learning preserved and transmitted during Charles's reign would continue to benefit future generations. As Charles entered the later years of his reign, he could look back with satisfaction on the transformation of Europe that had occurred under his leadership. The continent that had been a patchwork of warring tribes and petty kingdoms when he came to power was now largely unified under a single Christian empire. The borders of this empire were generally secure. Its internal peace was maintained by effective administration, and its people enjoyed a level of prosperity and security that had not been seen since the height of the Roman Empire. The emperor's daily routine in his later years reflected both his advancing age and his accumulated wisdom. He rose early each morning for private prayer, spending time in quiet communion with God before the demands of the day began. After attending Mass in the palace chapel, he would break his fast with a simple meal while reviewing the correspondence that had arrived during the night from various parts of the empire. The morning hours were typically devoted to the business of government, receiving reports from the Missi Dominici, consulting with his advisors on matters of policy, and making the countless decisions that were required to keep the imperial administration functioning smoothly. Charles approached these tasks with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized his entire career, understanding that effective governance required constant vigilance and adjustment. The afternoon hours were often spent in the company of scholars and visitors to the court. The emperor enjoyed these discussions, which ranged across topics from theology to natural philosophy, from poetry to military strategy. His questions were always penetrating, and his observations frequently illuminated aspects of problems that others had missed. Age had not dimmed his intellectual curiosity, but had rather deepened his understanding of the complexity and interconnectedness of all human knowledge. In the evenings, Charles would often take walks through the gardens of the palace, sometimes alone, and sometimes in the company of family members or close friends. These quiet hours provided him with time for reflection and prayer, opportunities to consider the great questions of human existence that had occupied his thoughts throughout his life. The gardens themselves were places of beauty and tranquility, with carefully tended flower beds, fruit trees, and herb gardens that provided both practical benefits and aesthetic pleasure. The question of succession became increasingly important as Charles aged and his mortality became more apparent. The emperor had several sons, but the Frankish tradition of dividing the kingdom among male heirs presented challenges for maintaining the unity that had been so carefully constructed over decades of conquest and administration. Charles wrestled with this problem for years, seeking a solution that would preserve the empire while respecting the legitimate expectations of his children. The emperor's approach to this dilemma reflected his deep understanding of both political reality and divine providence. He recognized that human institutions, no matter how carefully constructed, were temporary and that ultimate authority belonged to God alone. His planning for the succession was therefore conducted with a spirit of humility and trust in divine guidance, even as he took practical steps to ensure a smooth transition of power. In 806, Charles issued a document known as the Divisio Regnorum, which outlined his plans for dividing the empire among his 3 surviving sons. The plan was carefully crafted to maintain the overall unity of the realm, while giving each son a substantial territory to govern. The eldest son, Charles the Younger, would receive the heart of the Frankish kingdom. Pepin would inherit Italy and Bavaria, and Louis would rule over Aquitaine and the Spanish Marches. The Divisio Regnorum also included detailed provisions for maintaining cooperation among the brothers and for preserving the Christian character of their respective kingdoms. The sons were required to protect the church, maintain justice, and defend their territories against external enemies. They were forbidden from making war against each other without just cause, and they were expected to provide mutual assistance when faced with serious threats. However, the divine providence that Charles trusted to guide human affairs had different plans for the succession. By 810, both Charles the Younger and Pepin had died, leaving Louis as the sole surviving legitimate heir to the imperial title. This unexpected turn of events simplified the succession dramatically and allowed for the preservation of imperial unity that might otherwise have been impossible. Louis, who would later be known as Louis the Pious, was a man of deep religious conviction and considerable administrative ability. He had governed Aquitaine effectively for many years, demonstrating both military competence and wise judgment in civilian affairs. Charles recognized in his surviving son the qualities necessary for imperial leadership and began to prepare him systematically for the responsibilities he would inherit. The relationship between Charles and Louis during these final years was marked by mutual respect and growing collaboration. The emperor gradually delegated more authority to his son, allowing him to participate in major decisions and to gain experience in the complexities of imperial governance. Louis proved himself worthy of this trust, handling his responsibilities with discretion and wisdom that confirmed his fitness for supreme authority. In 813, Charles formally crowned Louis as co-emperor in a ceremony at Aachen that was both solemn and deeply moving. The aging emperor placed the crown on his son's head with his own hands, symbolically transferring the authority that he had exercised for over 4 decades. The ceremony was witnessed by nobles and clergy from throughout the empire, who pledged their loyalty to the new co-emperor and swore to support the continuity of Christian rule. The final months of Charles's life were spent in quiet preparation for the death that he knew was approaching. He continued to fulfill his imperial duties, but with a growing sense of detachment from worldly concerns. His thoughts turned increasingly to spiritual matters and to the final accounting that every soul must make before the throne of God. The emperor's last winter was marked by declining health, but undiminished faith. He attended Mass daily despite his physical weakness, finding comfort in the familiar rituals and prayers that had sustained him throughout his life. His confessor noted that he approached the prospect of death without fear, trusting in the mercy of God and in the salvation that had been promised to all who lived according to Christian principles. Charles died on January 28, 814, in his beloved palace at Aachen, surrounded by his family and closest advisors. His death was peaceful, coming after a brief illness that he bore with characteristic patience and dignity. His last words, according to those who were present, were a prayer for the continued prosperity of his empire and the salvation of his soul. The emperor's funeral was conducted with all the solemnity appropriate to his rank and achievements. His body was laid to rest in the chapel at Aachen that he had built as a symbol of his commitment to Christian kingship. The marble sarcophagus that contained his remains was decorated with scenes from the life of Christ, reminding all who saw it that earthly power was meaningful only insofar as it served divine purposes. The legacy of Charlemagne extended far beyond his immediate accomplishments in conquest and administration. He had created not just an empire, but an ideal of Christian civilization that would inspire rulers and thinkers for centuries to come. The concept of a unified Christian Europe, governed according to divine law and dedicated to the promotion of learning and culture, became a permanent part of European consciousness. The educational and cultural achievements of the Carolingian Renaissance provided the foundation for the intellectual developments of the later medieval period. The schools established during Charles's reign continued to operate long after his death, training generations of clergy and administrators who carried forward the ideals of Christian learning and effective governance. The manuscripts copied in Carolingian scriptoriums preserved classical and Christian texts that might otherwise have been lost, ensuring that the wisdom of the past would be available to future generations. The administrative systems developed during Charles's reign provided a model for later medieval governments. The concept of royal officials responsible to a central authority, the use of written law to ensure consistent justice, and the integration of diverse peoples under a single legal and administrative framework all became permanent features of European governance. These innovations helped to create the political structures that would eventually evolve into the modern nation-states of Europe. Perhaps most importantly, Charlemagne's reign demonstrated that effective leadership required not just military skill and political cunning, but also moral authority and intellectual depth. His example showed that true greatness came not from the accumulation of power for its own sake, but from the use of power in service to higher ideals. The emperor, who could conquer kingdoms with his sword, but who also spent his evenings studying grammar and theology, embodied an ideal of leadership that combined strength with wisdom, authority with humility. The memory of Charlemagne became legendary even during his own lifetime, and the legends only grew richer after his death. Stories of his deeds spread throughout Europe, carried by minstrels and chroniclers who transformed the historical emperor into a figure of romance and adventure. These tales, while often historically inaccurate, captured something essential about Charles's character and achievements that mere factual accounts could not convey. In the chanson de geste that celebrated his memory, Charlemagne became the ideal Christian king, the defender of the faith against pagan enemies, the patron of learning and culture, the just ruler who protected the weak and punished the wicked. These literary works, beginning with the Song of Roland, created an image of Charles that influenced European ideas about kingship and heroism for centuries to come. The historical Charlemagne was both more and less than the legendary figure. He was more human, with the limitations and contradictions that characterize all human beings. He made mistakes, suffered defeats, and sometimes struggled with the moral complexities of leadership. But he was also more remarkable than the legends suggested, because his achievements were accomplished not through supernatural aid, but through intelligence, persistence, and an unwavering commitment to his ideals. The empire that Charlemagne created did not long survive his death in its original form. Within a generation, it had been divided among his grandsons, and within a century, it had fragmented into the separate kingdoms that would become France, Germany, and Italy. But the ideal of European unity that he had embodied continued to inspire later generations of rulers and thinkers who looked back to his reign as a golden age of Christian civilization. The title of Holy Roman Emperor, which had been conferred on Charles in 800, continued to be claimed by German kings for over 1,000 years, until Napoleon finally abolished it in 1806. Each of these later emperors saw himself as the heir to Charlemagne's legacy, and many of them made genuine efforts to recreate the unity and prosperity that had characterized the Carolingian Empire. The influence of Charlemagne's educational and cultural policies extended even further into the future. The palace school at Aachen served as a model for later educational institutions, including the universities that began to emerge in the 12th century. The Caroline minuscule script developed during his reign remained the standard form of handwriting in Western Europe until the Renaissance, when it was revived as the model for printed fonts that are still used today. The legal and administrative innovations of the Carolingian period provided the foundation for the development of medieval and modern European law. The concept of written law codes, the use of royal officials to ensure consistent administration, and the integration of local customs into broader legal frameworks all became permanent features of European governance. These institutions helped to create the political stability that was necessary for the economic and cultural development of the continent. The church reforms initiated during Charles's reign had equally lasting effects. The standardization of liturgical practices, the improvement of clerical education, and the establishment of clear relationships between secular and ecclesiastical authority all contributed to the strengthening of Christian institutions throughout Europe. The monasteries that flourished under Carolingian patronage became centers of learning and agricultural innovation that helped to lay the groundwork for the economic expansion of the later medieval period. Perhaps most significantly, Charlemagne's reign established the idea that political authority in Christian Europe should be based not merely on force or hereditary right, but on moral legitimacy and divine sanction. The concept of the Christian king, ruling according to divine law for the benefit of his people, became a central element of European political thought. Even when rulers failed to live up to this ideal, it remained as a standard by which their performance could be judged. The physical remnants of Charlemagne's empire are still visible throughout Europe today. The chapel at Aachen, where he was crowned and buried, remains one of the finest examples of early medieval architecture, its soaring dome and intricate mosaics testifying to the artistic achievements of the Carolingian period. Churches, manuscripts, and archaeological remains throughout France, Germany, and Italy bear witness to the prosperity and cultural vitality of his reign. But the most enduring legacy of Charlemagne is perhaps the idea of Europe itself as a cultural and political entity. Before his reign, the continent was a collection of separate peoples with little sense of common identity or shared destiny. Through his conquests and his cultural policies, Charles began the process of creating a European consciousness that transcended tribal and national boundaries. The Europe that emerged from the Carolingian period was far from unified politically, but it shared a common religion, a common learned language in Latin, and common institutions based on Christian principles. This cultural unity provided the foundation for the later development of European civilization, including the medieval synthesis of classical and Christian thought, the Renaissance recovery of ancient learning, and the eventual emergence of the modern European political system. As we reflect on the life and achievements of Charlemagne from our modern perspective, we can see both the limitations of his age and the remarkable prescience of his vision. He lived in a world where communication was slow, transportation was difficult, and the tools of government were primitive by our standards. Yet he managed to create an empire that stretched across most of Western Europe and to establish institutions that would influence the development of European civilization for centuries to come. The challenges that Charlemagne faced were in many ways similar to those that confront leaders today. How to create unity while respecting diversity, how to maintain security while preserving freedom, how to promote prosperity while ensuring justice. His solutions were necessarily different from those available to modern leaders, but his approach to these problems, methodical, patient, guided by moral principles, remains relevant. The emperor's commitment to education and learning offers particularly important lessons for our own time. Charles understood that a society's greatest treasure was not its material wealth, but its accumulated knowledge and wisdom. He recognized that effective governance required not just skilled administrators, but truly educated human beings who could think clearly, communicate effectively, and make moral judgments based on sound principles. The Carolingian Renaissance demonstrated that periods of political stability and wise leadership could produce remarkable cultural achievements that would benefit humanity for generations to come. The manuscripts copied, the schools established, and the intellectual methods developed during Charles's reign preserved and transmitted knowledge that might otherwise have been lost during the turbulent centuries that followed. Charlemagne's life also illustrates the importance of personal character in leadership. His success was not due merely to favorable circumstances or superior resources, but to qualities of mind and spirit that enabled him to make the most of his opportunities. His intelligence, his persistence, his sense of justice, and his deep religious faith all contributed to his achievements as a ruler and as a human being. The emperor's understanding of the relationship between temporal and spiritual authority offers insights that remain relevant in our secular age. While few modern leaders would claim the kind of divine sanction that Charlemagne believed he possessed, his recognition that political power carries moral responsibilities and that leaders are accountable to standards higher than mere effectiveness remains important. As the evening shadows lengthen and we draw toward the close of this long tale, we can imagine the great emperor in his final years, walking through the gardens of his palace at Aachen as the sun sets behind the distant hills. His hair is white now, his step perhaps not as firm as it once was, but his eyes still hold the light of intelligence and purpose that had carried him through so many challenges and triumphs. The sounds of the palace settling into evening quiet surround him. The distant chanting of monks at vespers, the soft conversation of courtiers returning from their daily duties, the gentle splash of water in the fountains that cool the summer air. These familiar sounds speak of peace and prosperity, of an empire at rest after the labors of the day, of a civilization that has found its proper rhythm and direction. Looking back over the decades of his reign, Charles might reflect on how far his people had traveled from the world of his youth. The fierce Germanic tribes that had once roamed the forests of Europe had become Christian knights and scholars. The ruined cities of the old Roman Empire had been rebuilt and repopulated. Schools and monasteries dotted the landscape where once there had been only wilderness. The continent that had been divided by countless boundaries was now united under a single crown and a single faith. Yet the emperor would also know that his work was not complete and could never be complete in any final sense. Each generation would face its own challenges and would need to find its own solutions. The empire he had built would eventually pass away, as all human institutions must, but the ideals he had embodied, justice, learning, unity, faith, would endure as long as human beings continued to strive for something higher than mere survival. The legacy of Charlemagne lives on, not in the specific political arrangements he created, but in the example he provided of what human leadership could accomplish when guided by wisdom and dedicated to noble purposes. His reign demonstrated that it was possible to combine strength with gentleness, authority with humility, practical effectiveness with moral principle. In the words of Einhard, his loyal biographer and friend, who knew him better than perhaps any other person, he was large and strong and of lofty stature, though not disproportionately tall. He used to wear the national, that is to say, the Frank, dress. He was temperate in eating, and particularly so in drinking. He was eloquent and able to express clearly whatever he had to say. He was not satisfied with command of his native language merely, but gave attention to the study of foreign ones, and in particular was such a master of Latin that he could speak it as well as his native tongue, but he could understand Greek far better than he could speak it. But perhaps the most fitting tribute to Charlemagne comes from the simple fact that more than 12 centuries after his death, his name is still remembered with respect and admiration. In a world where so many rulers have been forgotten, where so many empires have crumbled into dust, The memory of this king who sought to build a Christian civilization based on justice and learning continues to inspire those who believe that human beings are capable of creating something beautiful and lasting. As we close this gentle tale of the great emperor, let us carry with us the image of Charlemagne in his chapel at Aachen, kneeling in prayer before the altar where he would one day be laid to rest. The flickering candles cast dancing shadows on the walls. The ancient stones seem to hold the prayers of centuries, and the silence is filled with the presence of the divine mystery that he served throughout his long and remarkable life. In that sacred space, surrounded by the beauty he had commissioned and the faith he had embraced, Charles the Great found the peace that had guided all his endeavors. It was the peace that comes from knowing that one has used the gifts God provided in service to purposes higher than personal ambition. The peace that comes from understanding that true greatness lies not in conquering others, but in conquering oneself. And so we leave him there in that timeless moment, the father of Europe at rest in the presence of his God, his work complete, his legacy secure, his example shining like a beacon across the centuries to illuminate the path for all who would seek to lead with wisdom, to rule with justice, and to build something worthy of the magnificent gift of human life itself. Rest now, dear listener, and let your dreams be filled with the peace of that ancient chapel, where a great king found his final rest after a life well lived in service to his people and his God.